William Brooks had never been the kind of man who enjoyed the company of others, nor did he particularly care about their opinions. He was a landowner by necessity rather than choice, having inherited his uncle's property on the edge of a small Midwestern town, a place where the fields seemed endless and the neighbors were close enough to nod at from a distance but far enough to ignore if one preferred silence. For William, silence was not only preferable but essential, a kind of shield that kept the outside world at bay. The land he had inherited came with no luxuries, no grand house, no modern conveniences, only a weather-beaten barn that had stood for nearly 80 years and the surrounding acres of grass and mud that were home to his livestock. The barn was more than a structure to him. It was memory solidified in wood and iron, a place where he had once followed his uncle as a boy, learning how to mend broken gates, stack hay properly so that it would not rot in the damp air, and treat animals with a practical, unsentimental care. When his uncle died, William did not have to think twice about moving in. The decision was obvious because abandoning the barn would have felt like abandoning his own blood. The barn, squat and broad with its faded red paint peeling into gray, was the true heart of the property. It smelled of dust, earth, and animals, and when William walked across its creaking boards, he could hear echoes of years past. His uncle's voice seemed to linger in the rafters, muttering about broken tractors or weather that would ruin the crops. Even the animals seemed to recognize the barn as more than shelter, as though they understood it to be the anchor of their little world. On stormy nights, when the wind beat against the windows of his modest farmhouse, William would walk across the yard with a lantern and sit inside the barn, listening to the rhythm of rain against the tin roof, and feel steadied by its solidity. It was the sort of place no rational person could mistake for anything but private property, marked on every old deed and county survey as belonging to the Brooks family. For William, the barn was not simply where he kept tools or animals. It was the proof that he belonged to the land as much as it belonged to him. That was why the first sign of intrusion felt so absurdly out of place that he almost laughed. It was late autumn, the sky heavy with clouds and the ground soft with mud, when he returned from town with a truckload of supplies and noticed at the far edge of the driveway a small white placard hammered into the ground near the barn. At first glance, it seemed like the sort of thing road crews left behind after repairing a ditch, nothing of consequence, but when he walked closer he realized the sign bore a polished emblem, embossed in gold paint, declaring, "Property of the Homeowners Association. Access restricted to authorized residents." He stared at the words, blinking, certain that it must have been some prank, because the barn had stood on his family's land since long before any association had ever existed in the area. The nearest HOA-controlled development was a cluster of identical beige houses a mile down the road, a place he avoided whenever possible, and the notion that they would extend their reach into his farmland seemed laughable. Yet the sign was real, and its plastic sheen caught the weak light of the setting sun like a taunt. William yanked the sign out of the soil with one pull and tossed it into the muck, muttering under his breath about bureaucrats with too much time on their hands. He assumed that would be the end of it, a single ridiculous mistake to be forgotten by the next morning. But the barn stood there in silence, almost as if it knew better, as if it could sense the storm that was beginning to gather on the horizon. The following week, William began to notice things that unsettled him in ways he could not easily explain. It was not just the white placard that he had ripped from the ground, though he did wonder who had placed it there so neatly, with such deliberate formality, but the subtle changes around the barn itself. A fresh padlock appeared on the side door one morning, gleaming and new, though William knew very well that he had never installed it. The lock bore a small stamped number, like the kind used in storage units or commercial facilities, and when he rattled it angrily the cows stirred inside, unsettled by the sound. The next day, faint chalk markings showed up along the foundation stones, cryptic arrows and letters that made no sense but suggested some sort of survey had been carried out without his knowledge. Then came the letter. It was delivered not through the regular postal service but slipped under his door, printed on thick paper, bearing a letterhead that read, Homeowners Association, Community Development Division. The text was short and unbearably smug. Notice of Jurisdictional Adjustment. Pursuant to the revised Zoning Integration Plan, your outbuilding identified as Parcel 7B, Structure Code AGR14, has been incorporated into the Community Property Register. You are advised to vacate said structure for repurposing no later than 30 days from the date of this notice. Your cooperation ensures a smooth transition into our shared future. William read the words 3 times, his jaw tightening with each line, until finally he crumpled the paper in his fist and threw it into the wood stove. It burned too quickly, like it had been waiting for the flame. At first he thought it had to be an error, some bureaucratic misstep, maybe even a scam. But when he drove into town to confront the county clerk, the situation only grew stranger. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with heavy glasses and a monotone voice, tapped at her computer and explained with unsettling calm that the property had been included in a passive incorporation process initiated by the local HOA after a zoning update the previous season. When William demanded to know how they could possibly claim a barn that had been in his family for nearly a century, she replied without looking up from her screen, You were sent an invitation to participate in the Community Integration Initiative. Lack of response is legally interpreted as implied consent. William slammed his fist on the counter, startling the woman enough that she finally raised her eyes, but she only repeated the same phrase as though reciting scripture. Passive incorporation. Implied consent. You are free to challenge the decision through the appeals subcommittee, but you should be aware the process is lengthy and rarely successful. Driving back, William felt a heat rising in his chest. The kind that was not just anger, but something more. Dangerous. Something that could twist a man into violence if he let it. The barn stood in the distance, visible across the muddy fields, stoic and solid, yet now surrounded by invisible wires of legal jargon and absurd rules that seemed designed to strangle anyone who dared resist. When he parked his truck, he noticed another detail. A laminated sheet taped directly to the barn door. This one bore the HOA emblem in crisp blue ink, announcing an upcoming community engagement session, scheduled to take place inside the barn in less than a week. His barn, his animals, his tools. The idea that a group of strangers would stroll in, sit down on folding chairs, and discuss landscaping ordinances while the smell of hay and manure clung to their clothes was so grotesque that he laughed aloud. But it was laughter without joy. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat in the farmhouse kitchen, staring at the darkness outside, listening to the wind rattle the thin window panes. Every creak from the barn sounded amplified, like a warning. He thought about his uncle, who had always distrusted officials, always muttering that laws were not written for people who worked with their hands, but for those who wanted to own what others had built. William had dismissed those warnings in his youth, thinking them the bitter paranoia of an old man. But now they rang with a truth so sharp it made his stomach turn. When morning came, he did what he always did. Fed the livestock, checked the fences, repaired a broken hinge. Yet, even these simple tasks felt hollow, overshadowed by the absurd knowledge that someone else now claimed ownership of the barn that made those chores meaningful. 2 days later, a pickup truck rolled slowly up his gravel driveway. It was not a neighbor but 3 men dressed in identical gray jackets, each holding a tablet device, their smiles too wide to be genuine. The driver introduced himself as Darren Frost, liaison for community alignment, while the others hovered silently behind him. Darren explained with practiced courtesy that the barn had been reclassified as a shared-use facility, and that William's cooperation would prevent unnecessary fines. He spoke of synergy, aesthetic coherence, and future forward planning, as though these words were enough to erase the decades of sweat and labor that had seeped into the barn's walls. When William demanded to see proof of their authority, Darren produced a glossy booklet filled with charts and diagrams, none of which made any sense. The pages looked official but meaningless, a performance of legality. "This is ridiculous," William said through clenched teeth. Darren's smile never faltered. "Resistance to integration is a recognized emotional stage," he replied as though quoting from a manual. "Most property owners adjust over time." When the men left, the barn seemed different to William, no longer a place of shelter but a contested territory, a battlefield waiting for the first shot. The absurdity of the situation pressed down on him with suffocating weight. He was not dealing with thieves who could be chased away, nor neighbors who could be reasoned with, but an entire machinery of rules and signatures that could strip a man of his land without ever setting foot in a courtroom. That night, he sat again in the kitchen, the letter burned, the laminated notice still hanging on the barn door, and he realized with sick certainty that the coming days would test not just his patience but his very grip on what it meant to own, something in a world where silence could be twisted into surrender. The morning of the scheduled community engagement session arrived with the kind of gray, oppressive weather that made the air feel heavy and damp, the kind of day when even the animals moved more slowly as though burdened by something they could not name. William woke before dawn, restless, pacing the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring out the window at the barn that stood like a stubborn sentinel against the absurd claims of strangers. He told himself that perhaps no one would come, that perhaps this meeting had been some empty threat designed only to unsettle him. But deep down he knew that people who trafficked in rules and paperwork rarely bluffed. Around 9 o'clock the first cars began to arrive, pulling cautiously into his driveway as though they were visiting a public building rather than trespassing on private land. William stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed, watching as a small crowd of neatly dressed men and women climbed out, each carrying folders and reusable water bottles, their shoes ill-suited for the mud that clung to them immediately. At their head was a woman he recognized from the glossy booklet Darren Frost had shown him earlier, Lauren Pierce, president of the local HOA. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with a crisp suit jacket and hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, the sort of person who had long ago mastered the art of speaking with authority even when saying nothing. Of substance. Lauren greeted him with a smile that barely concealed disdain and said, "Mr. Brooks, we appreciate your cooperation in allowing us to hold this meeting in the designated facility." For a moment, William thought he might explode, but instead he let out a long, slow breath, trying to rein in the fury that burned through his chest. "This isn't a facility," he said, his voice low but steady. "This is my barn, and you're trespassing." Lauren's smile did not falter. "According to the revised integration plan, it is now community property," she replied smoothly, gesturing for the others to follow her toward the barn. They filed in behind her, undeterred by the mud, their shoes squeaking against the wooden boards inside as if they were entering a sterile conference room rather than a working-out building filled with the smells of livestock and old hay. William followed, seething, as they unfolded plastic chairs and arranged them in neat rows between the feed bins and the milking stalls. One man connected a projector to a portable battery and began displaying charts against the side of the barn, the faded wood serving as a backdrop for words like shared vision and harmonization. The cows shifted uneasily in their pens, snorting at the intrusion, while the HOA members took notes and murmured agreement as Lauren spoke about optimizing usage of communal assets. The absurdity of the scene was so complete that William found himself momentarily speechless, watching as his barn was transformed into a parody of a boardroom. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "You can sit here with your papers and your charts, but this land is mine. My uncle built this barn with his hands. I've kept it standing with my own. No bylaw or committee can change that. The room fell silent for a moment, but then Lauren replied in a tone dripping with false sympathy. "We understand your attachment, Mr. Brooks, but personal sentiment cannot override community progress. You are free to submit a petition to the subcommittee for property exceptions, though I must warn you that such petitions rarely succeed." The words ignited something in him. He grabbed one of the plastic chairs, folded it with a snap, and carried it to the open door. Without a word, he hurled it into the mud outside. Gasps filled the barn, and someone whispered about calling the police, but William only glared, his chest heaving. "You want to hold meetings here? Fine. But you'll do it under my rules." He walked past them, out to the pigsty adjacent to the barn, where the animals rooted noisily in the straw. The smell was pungent, overpowering, but to William it smelled of reality, of earth and life, not of sterile nonsense. He returned, pointing at the sty. "That's your conference room. Go on, hold your session there if you're so convinced this place belongs to you." For a moment, no one moved. Then Lauren, maintaining her composure with visible effort, motioned for the group to follow her. They gathered their papers and chairs, muttering with discomfort, and marched into the pigsty. The pigs, curious, sniffed at their polished shoes and brushed against their legs, leaving streaks of mud and filth on expensive fabrics. Still, the members forced smiles and attempted to continue their agenda. Their voices strained as they discussed budgets and landscaping while surrounded by squealing animals. William leaned against the barn door, arms folded, and watched with grim satisfaction. The meeting lasted nearly an hour, punctuated by the sounds of pigs rooting and grunting, until finally Lauren declared it adjourned, her smile cracked and brittle. The members left quickly, avoiding William's gaze, their clothes smeared and their dignity eroded. Lauren lingered, though, stepping close enough to speak in a low voice. "You may think this is amusing, Mr. Brooks, but you cannot fight the process. We will take what belongs to the community, whether you cooperate or not." She turned sharply and walked to her car, her heels clicking against the mud as if she could will it to behave like pavement. When the last vehicle disappeared down the road, William stood alone again with his barn, the pigs still grunting contentedly in their pen. He felt no triumph, only the grim knowledge that this was the first skirmish in a larger war. The HOA had shown that they were willing to humiliate themselves rather than admit defeat, and that kind of stubbornness was dangerous. As he closed the barn doors and leaned against the rough wood, he realized with cold certainty that they would be back, and next time they would not come armed only with papers and charts. The days after the pigsty confrontation carried with them a strange quiet, the kind of silence that makes a man uneasy rather than calm, as though the world itself is holding its breath. William tried to return to his ordinary routine of tending livestock, repairing fences, and keeping the barn in order, but the rhythm of work felt altered, tainted by the memory of the neatly dressed strangers sitting stiffly in the mud beside his. Pigs, trying to preserve their dignity while scribbling minutes into their notebooks. It would have been comical if not for the words Lauren Pierce had whispered before leaving, words that carried the weight of a promise rather than a threat. He had known stubborn men and dishonest men in his life, but the kind of people who smiled as they dismantled what did not belong to them were a different breed entirely, and it was that particular breed that now circled around him like wolves at the edge of a fire. It was on the third evening, as he was stacking bales of hay in the loft, that William noticed something that made his stomach twist. Tucked between the rafters, slipped in so carefully that he would not have seen it without climbing the ladder, was a glossy envelope. Inside, instead of the usual officious letters, he found a packet of photographs, aerial shots of his property, the barn outlined in red ink, and attached to each photo a page of typed notes describing potential redevelopment scenarios. The language was clinical, but the message clear. Proposals for tearing down the barn to construct what was called a multi-use community hub. One plan showed a parking lot sprawling across the pasture. Another depicted glass walls replacing the barn's wood, transforming it into a hollow imitation of modern design. At the bottom of the last page, stamped in ink, were the words, "Preliminary approval, pending community ratification." William crushed the papers in his hands, the sound of the cows shifting uneasily below as though they, too, sensed the desecration that was being plotted. He drove to town the next morning, the packet of photographs on the passenger seat, and demanded an audience at the county zoning office. After an hour of waiting, he was shown into a small, airless room where a junior official with thinning hair and nervous eyes explained that these plans were part of a pilot project under review. William slammed the packet onto the table, the papers scattering like startled birds. "This is my land," he said, each word like a stone thrown into still water. The official cleared his throat, avoiding William's gaze, and replied with rehearsed calm, "The parcel in question has been temporarily earmarked for community development under the Integration Act. You may contest the classification, but until the appeal is resolved, the HOA retains conditional authority over the structure." The bureaucratic phrases felt like a foreign language designed not to communicate but to suffocate, and William left the office with the sick understanding that logic and law were not weapons he could wield here. That evening, unable to sleep, he rummaged through his uncle's old desk in the farmhouse, the drawers filled with yellowed receipts, dog-eared manuals, and bundles of twine. At the very back, he discovered a folder marked in his uncle's heavy scrawl, "Property Papers." Inside, carefully folded, was a deed dated 1956 that described the barn not simply as an outbuilding, but as an ancestral structure, exempt from collective zoning agreements under Article 12 of the county charter. It bore signatures, a seal, and even the name of the official who had filed it, long dead now but once an authority beyond dispute. William read the document again and again, each time feeling a surge of defiance rise within him. His uncle had known something like this might happen. The barn was not merely old wood and nails, it was a legacy fortified by paper as well as memory. The next day he sought out a lawyer, a woman named Evelyn Marks who operated out of a cramped office above the hardware store. She was sharp-eyed, with a manner that was both brusque and reassuring, the kind of person who wasted no time on pleasantries but gave the impression of competence. William laid the deed on her desk and explained the situation from the beginning, his voice steady though his hands betrayed his agitation. Evelyn studied the document in silence for several minutes before nodding slowly. "This is strong," she said, "very strong. But you need to understand something. The HOA thrives on dragging these matters into endless committees, subcommittees, and review boards until most people give up. They rely on fatigue, not merit. If you want to fight this, you need stamina, because they will not stop." Her words struck him with both relief and dread. At least he was not mad. At least the law, as it was written, did still hold some power, but the thought of months or even years of battles through paperwork and hearings was enough to drain a man dry. Still, when he left her office with copies of the deed carefully sealed in a folder, he felt a flicker of something he had not felt in days. Hope. It was not a triumphant hope, not a certainty of victory, but a stubborn belief that the barn's story was not yet finished. That night, however, his optimism was tested. Returning from the pasture, he saw movement near the barn and approached cautiously, his boots crunching in the gravel. The glow of a flashlight flickered inside, and when he pushed the door open he found two men in work overalls, clipboards in hand, measuring the interior with metal tapes. Startled, they muttered something about structural assessment and tried to brush past him, but William blocked the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. "Get out," he growled. They hesitated only briefly before scurrying away into the dark, leaving behind a dropped clipboard. William picked it up and scanned the notes. Phase 1, Demolition. Estimated cost allocation, $42,000. Projected timeline, 6 weeks. His grip tightened until the wood splintered beneath his fingers. By the time he locked the barn doors and leaned against them, breath ragged, he realized the nature of his battle had shifted. This was no longer an abstract fight over paperwork or zoning. Strangers had stepped onto his land, into his barn, with tape measures and plans for its destruction. That intrusion marked a turning point, not just legally, but personally. They were no longer shadows hiding behind rules. They were here, flesh and blood, confident enough to measure what they intended to steal. And William knew, with the clarity of a man staring at the edge of a cliff, that from this moment on there could be no return to silence, because silence had been twisted into consent once already, and he would not allow it to happen again. The following week began with a kind of unease that William could not shake, a restless energy in the air that made every ordinary task feel charged with hidden menace. He rose before dawn each day, walked the perimeter of his land with the dogs at his heels, checked the locks on the barn, and stood for long moments staring at its weathered boards as though sheer vigilance could hold back the tide that pressed against him. For a few days there was no sign of the HOA, no strange cars creeping down his road, no officials slipping papers under his door, and he began to wonder if perhaps the confrontation with the intruders had forced them to slow their advance. But the quiet was only a pause, and when the storm came again it was sharper, more organized, and unmistakably deliberate. It began with letters. Not one, but several, delivered in thick envelopes, each stamped with an unfamiliar seal, each bearing titles that sounded like they had been designed to confuse rather than clarify. Notice of non-compliance regarding transitional facility, preliminary fine schedule for obstructive behavior, and reminder of mandatory cooperation with community engagement protocol. William read them by lantern light at the kitchen table, his eyes narrowing with each line. The fines listed were outrageous, escalating from hundreds to thousands of dollars, accompanied by warnings of legal remedies up to and including foreclosure of property assets. He could not help but laugh bitterly at the absurdity. They wanted him to pay them for occupying his own barn, for refusing to step aside while they measured its walls for demolition. The laughter, however, did not last long. It curdled into something darker when he realized that each envelope bore not the HOA logo but variations of county and state insignias, suggesting a web of cooperation that extended beyond the petty ambitions of Lauren Pierce and her board. William brought the stack of letters to Evelyn Marks, the lawyer, who scanned them quickly and muttered under her breath. She explained that while many of the documents looked official, they were built on shaky foundations, exploiting vague language in the zoning statutes. Still, she warned him that the strategy was clear: to overwhelm him with paperwork, drain his resources, and force him into a mistake they could seize upon. "They want you to get tired, to lose focus," she said. "But if you can hold steady, we may be able to expose the inconsistencies. This deed of yours gives us leverage, but they will not admit defeat easily." Returning home with her words ringing in his head, William found a fresh insult waiting for him. His driveway was blocked by orange barricades, the kind used for road construction, each stamped with "Property Access Under Review." A laminated notice hung from one. "Entry restricted pending compliance evaluation." He drove straight through the barricades, the plastic cracking beneath his tires, and parked beside the barn with his chest heaving. That night he sat awake on the porch with a shotgun across his knees, not because he intended to use it, but because the weight of it was the only thing that steadied his nerves against the creeping sense that he was being slowly smothered. 2 nights later, his fears proved justified. Woken by the restless barking of the dogs, William grabbed a lantern and stepped into the yard to find smoke curling from the far side of the barn. He sprinted across the mud, heart pounding, and discovered that a bundle of straw had been set ablaze near the wall. The fire licked upward, catching on the old boards, but he managed to douse it with water before it spread too far. The smell of scorched wood clung to his clothes as he stood in the darkness, staring at the blackened marks left behind. Whether it was a warning or a genuine attempt to destroy the barn, the message was clear. This was no longer just about legal maneuvers or fines. The battle had shifted into something more dangerous, where intimidation and sabotage walked hand in hand with bureaucracy. The next morning, he discovered another envelope, nailed directly to the barn door with a heavy tack. Inside was not a letter, but a map, drawn with precision, showing his property divided into neat squares, each labeled with coded numbers. At the bottom was a stamped line, "Reallocation for future use, authorized." He studied the map for a long time, then set it on the table beside the old deed from his uncle, the two documents glaring at each other like enemies across a battlefield. One represented memory and inheritance, the other a cold diagram that reduced his life to parcels waiting for repurposing. It was then that he made his decision. If they insisted on treating the barn as a shared-use facility, then he would show them exactly what that meant, on his own terms. He began by moving half his tools and feed bins into the pigsty, rearranging the space so that it resembled a crude assembly hall, with hay bales for benches and the floor slick with mud. The pigs, confused at first, adapted quickly, grunting as they explored the new arrangement. William placed a battered chalkboard against the wall, scrawling across it in thick white letters, "Community Boardroom." Then he left the doors wide open, knowing that word of his gesture would spread faster than any letter. When the HOA delegation returned a few days later, led again by Lauren Pierce, they found themselves ushered into the pigsty by William himself. "You want a hub?" he said, his voice flat. "Here it is. This is what community looks like." The air was thick with the stench of manure, the ground uneven beneath their polished shoes, but they seated themselves reluctantly on the hay bales, trying to pretend they had not been humiliated. Lauren's eyes glittered with fury, but she forced her voice into calm politeness as she opened the meeting. William stood back, arms folded, watching them with grim satisfaction, though deep down he knew that this victory was fragile. The fire, the barricades, the endless letters, these were only the opening moves. When the meeting ended, Lauren lingered again, stepping closer, her face hard. "You can mock us all you want, mister." "Brooks," she said softly, "but this barn is already gone. You just don't realize it yet." Then she turned sharply and walked away, leaving him with the echo of her words and the sour certainty that the worst was still to come. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a repurposed municipal building that smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning solution, a place where the walls were lined with mismatched chairs and the air buzzed with the low murmur of bureaucrats, who seemed more concerned with procedure than justice. William arrived early, carrying under his arm a thick folder that held the deed his uncle had left behind, the photographs of the barn, and copies of every letter and notice he had received in the past 2 months. He looked out of place among the neatly dressed HOA representatives, men and women in suits who clutched clipboards and tablets, whispering to one another as if rehearsing lines for a performance. At their center stood Lauren Pierce, poised and immaculate, her expression calm in a way that struck William as carefully manufactured, the calm of someone who already believed the outcome was decided. When the proceedings began, Lauren rose first, her voice smooth and practiced, presenting the case as though the barn were already theirs. She spoke of community assets, of shared progress, of the necessity of harmonizing legacy structures with modern needs, her words delivered with a confidence that made the absurd sound almost reasonable. Charts were projected onto a screen, diagrams of redevelopment scenarios that portrayed the barn not as it was but as a hollow shell to be stripped and repurposed. She concluded with a smile toward the panel of officials, as though to signal that everything had been neatly wrapped, the matter reduced to a formality. Then it was William's turn. He stood slowly, unfolded the deed, and placed it on the table where the officials could see the faded signatures, the embossed seal, the words written clearly. Exempt from collective zoning agreements under Article 12. His voice was steady but laced with the weight of sleepless nights and smoldering anger as he told them what the barn meant, not just to him, but to the history of his family and the community. He described the intrusions, the padlocks, the fire set in the night, the strangers with tape measures who treated his property as if it already belonged to them. He held up the photographs he had found hidden in the rafters, the maps stamped with reallocation, and demanded to know how consent could be twisted into silence, how ownership could be undone by acronyms and signatures that no one understood. The room grew still, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he saw cracks appear in the faces of the officials, a flicker of unease that betrayed uncertainty. Evelyn Marks, his lawyer, followed his words with precision, pointing out the inconsistencies in the HOA's paperwork, the illegal way notices had been delivered, the deliberate bypassing of due process. She moved through the evidence like a surgeon, careful and relentless, and when she finished, there was no mistaking the shift in the room. The officials who had entered with indifferent expressions now shuffled their papers with discomfort, their authority momentarily shaken. Lauren tried to interrupt, tried to steer the discussion back to the language of integration and shared values. But her words fell flat, the sheen of inevitability stripped away. The decision did not come immediately. The panel withdrew for what felt like hours, leaving William to pace the hallway outside, staring out at the parking lot where the rain came down in steady sheets. When they finally returned, the chairman read from a typed statement, his voice formal and cautious. The foreclosure and reclassification were annulled. The barn was to be restored to William's sole ownership, and the HOA was ordered to cease any further attempts to claim jurisdiction over it. There was no apology, no recognition of the turmoil inflicted, only the dry language of legal correction. But to William, it was enough. Lauren's face remained composed, but her eyes burned with quiet rage as the officials dispersed. She passed William in silence, her perfume sharp in the stale air, and for a moment he wondered if this victory would truly hold, if people like her ever truly accepted defeat. But when he stepped outside into the rain and looked back at the barn that waited for him, scarred but standing, he felt a weight lift from his chest. The fight had been brutal, absurd, almost surreal, but for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to breathe deeply, the air cool and clean against his lungs, the certainty in his mind as solid as the earth beneath his boots. The barn was his, and no boardroom or bylaw could change that. The weeks that followed carried with them a stillness that felt almost unnatural after the storm of letters, barricades, and confrontations. William found himself waking early out of habit, half expecting to see another notice pinned to the barn or strangers wandering the pasture with clipboards. But the road remained empty, the fields quiet except for the sounds of animals going about. Their lives. Slowly, the tension that had bound his shoulders began to ease, though the scars of the fight remained visible. The charred mark on the barn wall where the fire had licked upward, the splintered wood around the doors where intruders had tried to force their way in, the stack of envelopes that still sat unopened in the corner of his kitchen. He did not throw them away. He kept them as reminders of how fragile ownership could become when tested by those who valued rules more than truth. One crisp morning he carried a hammer and a wooden board to the barn and fixed a new sign above the doors. It was simple, carved with rough letters, but it spoke more clearly than any document. Family land. No trespassing. The animals shifted behind him, the cows lowing, the pigs rooting noisily, and for the first time in months he felt something close, to peace. There was no triumphal celebration, no gathering of neighbors to applaud his defiance, only the quiet satisfaction of having endured. The barn had stood through storms, neglect, and now bureaucracy, and it would stand still, not because officials had permitted it, but because he had refused to yield. Sometimes, in the evenings, as the sun slid low over the fields and painted the sky in long streaks of red and gold, William would lean against the barn door and let the silence wash over him. He thought of his uncle and the generations before him who had worked this land, who had known the weight of labor and the meaning of ownership, and he felt tethered to them in a way that no committee could sever. The HOA might regroup, might find other battles to wage against other landowners, but for now they had retreated, their ambition checked at the threshold of his barn. William did not fool himself into thinking the world had been set right, but as he looked out across the fields he knew one thing with certainty. Some places do not belong to plans or policies. They belong to memory, to blood, to those willing to stand and defend them,